Most people think they understand what it means to be still, but they're living from a mind that never stops moving, filling every silence with worry, with planning, with the noise of trying to fix things. This keeps them trapped in endless cycles of anxiety and searching, never touching the presence of God that has been quietly waiting beneath every prayer they've ever spoken. When Joel Goldsmith discovered what "be still and know that I am God" actually means, everything changed. He wasn't talking about simply doing nothing. He was pointing to the one quiet place fear cannot follow you. When Joel Goldsmith read the words "be still and know that I am God," he understood something most people miss entirely. Stillness was never about sitting motionless in a chair. It was never about emptying your calendar or waiting for silence to arrive from outside. The stillness, he discovered, was a condition of the heart, a quieting of the part of you that believes it must constantly strive, calculate, and control in order to be safe. Most people carry a mind that is always working, even in prayer. They ask, they plead, they present their case to God as though he needs convincing. Joel taught that this kind of praying is actually the opposite of stillness. It is human effort wearing the costume of faith. True stillness begins the moment you stop trying to make something happen and start recognizing what has already happened. God's presence is not something you summon through the right words or the right amount of desperation. It is not a reward for sufficient faith or an answer that arrives after enough asking. It is already here, closer than your next breath, present in this exact moment regardless of what your circumstances look like. The mind resists this teaching because the mind was trained to believe that effort produces results. Work harder, pray longer, worry more, and eventually things will change. But Joel discovered that the very act of striving mentally is what blocks your awareness of what is already true. You cannot force your way into a peace that is only found by releasing the force. This is why being still is so difficult for most people. It requires you to stop doing the one thing your mind has always relied on, trying to fix things through sheer effort. Instead, you are asked to rest, to trust, to let your awareness settle into a presence that was never absent in the first place. This does not mean stillness is passive or that it excuses inaction in your life. It means your actions begin to flow from a different place. Instead of moving from fear, scrambling to solve a problem before it grows worse, you move from a quiet confidence that God is already present within the situation. You act because you are guided, not because you are afraid. Joel called this the practice of the presence of God, and he was careful to explain that it is a practice, not a single moment of insight. It is something you return to again and again, especially in the moments when your mind wants to take back control. Every time you catch yourself spinning through worry, planning 10 steps ahead, or rehearsing an argument in your head, that is your invitation to stop and remember. Be still. Not still as in frozen, but still as in surrendered. The Hebrew word behind that verse in Psalm 46 carries the sense of letting your hands drop, releasing your grip, ceasing to fight. It is the picture of a soldier finally laying down his weapon because the battle was never his to win through struggle. This is the heart of what Joel was pointing to. God does not need your anxious effort in order to act on your behalf. He asks you to stop interfering long enough to notice that he already is. When you rest in that stillness, even for a few seconds, something shifts. Your breathing slows, your thoughts quiet, and underneath all the noise you have been carrying, there is a presence that was never disturbed, never in a hurry, and never far away. This is not something you have to build through years of discipline before you can experience it. It is available right now, in this very moment, the instant you stop trying so hard and simply become still enough to know. Joel Goldsmith noticed a mistake almost everyone makes when they first hear the words "be still." They imagine it means pausing for a moment before returning to their usual striving, a brief breath before the next round of worry, planning, and effort. This is not stillness. It is simply a short intermission inside the same anxious pattern. The mind takes a break, then picks up exactly where it left off, still convinced that the answer will eventually come through enough thinking, enough pushing, enough control. Another common error is treating silence as an empty container that needs to be filled quickly. People sit down to be still with God, and within seconds they are listing requests, rehearsing problems, or presenting arguments for why their situation deserves attention. The silence becomes crowded with words, and the very stillness they came looking for gets buried under their own voice. Joel taught that this kind of praying, however sincere, keeps a person on the surface. It never reaches the deeper quiet where God's presence is actually recognized. Many people also confuse being still with doing nothing at all, and this misunderstanding causes them to avoid the practice entirely. They believe stillness means abandoning responsibility, ignoring real problems, or pretending that difficulties do not exist. But Joel was clear that stillness is not the absence of action. It is the absence of anxious striving underneath the action. A person can be fully engaged in solving a problem, making a decision, or caring for a family, while still carrying an inner stillness that has stopped fighting for control. The mistake is assuming that letting go of struggle means letting go of responsibility, when in truth, it means releasing the fear that was driving the struggle in the first place. There is also a subtler error, one that looks spiritual on the outside but still misses the point entirely. Some people treat stillness as a technique, something to perform correctly in order to earn a result. They sit quietly, repeat a verse, and wait for God to respond the way they respond to a request submitted correctly. This turns stillness into another form of striving, just dressed in a quieter outfit. The heart is still saying, "If I do this right, I will get what I want." Joel taught that stillness is not a method for extracting an outcome from God. It is a recognition that His presence was never withheld to begin with. Perhaps the deepest mistake is believing that stillness must be achieved through willpower, that a person has to force their mind to stop moving through sheer determination. This approach almost always backfires, because fighting your thoughts into silence is still fighting. It is still the mind trying to control the mind. What Joel discovered instead was that true quiet comes not from suppressing the noise, but from shifting your attention away from it, toward the presence that has been there all along. You do not silence the storm by wrestling with it. You simply stop feeding it your attention, and it eventually loses its grip on you. Recognizing these mistakes matters because they explain why so many people read "Be still" and "Know that I am God," yet never actually experience the peace those words promise. They are still striving, still filling the silence, still performing, still fighting their own minds. Real stillness begins only when all of that finally stops. A woman came to one of Joel's classes after 3 years of barely sleeping through a single night. She had tried every remedy she could find: sleeping pills, herbal teas, sound machines, exhausting exercise routines meant to wear her body down enough to rest. Nothing worked because the real problem was never her body. It was her mind, racing the moment her head touched the pillow, replaying conversations, rehearsing tomorrow's problems, bracing for whatever might go wrong next. She told Joel that the moment the lights went out, her thoughts got louder instead of quieter. She would lie there for hours, watching the clock, feeling her own exhaustion turn into panic as the night slipped away from her. Joel listened to her carefully, and then he asked her a simple question. He asked whether she had ever actually tried being still, not just lying still, but letting her mind stop reaching for control. She admitted she hadn't. She had been lying still every night for years, but her thoughts had never once stopped moving. Her body was resting while her mind kept working overtime, trying to solve problems that had no business being solved at midnight. Joel explained that stillness was not something that happened to her body automatically, just because she stopped moving. It was something her mind had to choose, again and again, every time it reached for another worry. He gave her a simple practice. Each night, instead of trying to force sleep, she would quietly repeat the words "Be still," and "Know that I am God," slowly, without rushing, letting each word settle before moving to the next. She was not to use it as a magic phrase to make sleep arrive faster. She was to use it as a reminder of where her attention belonged. The first night she tried it, she said her mind fought back harder than ever. It kept slipping back into its usual patterns, replaying an argument from earlier that day, worrying about a bill that was due, wondering if she had said the wrong thing to her sister on the phone. Every time she noticed this happening, she gently returned to the words, be still. Not with frustration, not with force, just a quiet redirection, the way you might guide a wandering child back toward home. She did not fall asleep quickly that first night, but something did shift. For the first time in years, she felt like she was choosing where her attention went, instead of being dragged along by every anxious thought that appeared. Within a few nights, she noticed the panic beginning to soften. The clock watching became less frequent. Her thoughts still arose, but they no longer felt like emergencies demanding her full attention. She began to sense, faintly at first, a quiet underneath all the noise, a presence that had apparently been there the whole time, waiting for her to stop drowning it out. She told Joel later that what surprised her most wasn't that she eventually started sleeping again, though she did. What surprised her was how her days began to change as well. She found herself less reactive at work, less quick to spiral into worst-case thinking when something unexpected happened. The practice she had started using only at night began showing up during the day too. In traffic, in difficult conversations, in ordinary moments of stress that used to send her mind racing. She realized that her sleeplessness had never really been about the night at all. It had been about a mind that had never learned how to stop striving, how to release its grip, how to trust that everything did not depend on her figuring it all out through worry. Joel often pointed to her story when teaching about the difference between physical rest and true stillness. He explained that a person can lie motionless for 8 hours and never once touch the peace that Scripture speaks of, because their mind is still fighting, still gripping, still trying to control outcomes it was never meant to control alone. True stillness, he said, is available in the middle of the day, just as much as it is in the middle of the night. It is not a technique for falling asleep faster. It is a returning to the presence that has never actually left, no matter how loudly the mind insists otherwise. What changed for this woman was not that her circumstances suddenly became easier. Her job was still demanding. Her family still had its usual tensions. Life did not pause to accommodate her healing. What changed was her relationship to the noise inside her own head. She stopped believing that she had to solve every problem before she could rest. She began trusting that rest itself, real stillness, was where clarity would eventually come from, not the other way around. Years later, she still used that same simple practice whenever her mind began to spin. Be still and know. Not as a demand for sleep, not as a formula for fixing her circumstances, but as a quiet return to the one place where nothing was ever actually as urgent as her anxious thoughts had made it seem. She had spent years trying to force peace into her life through effort. What finally worked was learning to stop long enough to notice it had been waiting for her all along. A man came to Joel during a season when he was facing a decision that would affect his entire family, whether to accept a job in another city or stay where his children had spent their whole lives. He had spent months turning the decision over in his mind, making lists, weighing pros and cons, talking to friends, reading every article he could find about how to choose wisely. None of it brought him any closer to clarity. If anything, the more he thought about it, the more tangled his thoughts became, until he could no longer tell whether his reasoning was leading him toward the truth or simply toward whichever option felt safest that day. He told Joel that he had prayed about the decision constantly, but his prayers had mostly consisted of presenting God with his pro and con lists, asking for a sign, pleading for clarity, as though enough asking would eventually force an answer into existence. Joel listened, and then told him something that surprised him. He said the man had been praying with his mind instead of praying with his whole being, and that no amount of mental effort was going to produce the clarity he was looking for. What he needed instead was to stop reasoning long enough to let stillness do what reasoning could not. Joel suggested a practice that felt almost too simple for a man who had spent months in exhausting analysis. Each morning, before looking at his lists or replaying his arguments, he was to sit quietly for 10 minutes and simply rest in the words, "Be still, and know that I am God." He was not to use the time to ask questions or search for the answer. He was to use it to stop searching altogether, to let his mind settle the way water settles once nothing is stirring it. The man admitted later that the first few mornings felt almost unbearable. His mind kept reaching for the decision, trying to sneak it back into his thoughts disguised as a passing idea. He would notice himself halfway through building another argument for one city over the other, and he would gently return to stillness, releasing the thought without chasing it further. It felt unproductive at first, like he was wasting valuable time he could have spent thinking the problem through. But he kept at it, morning after morning, because nothing else had worked and he had run out of other options. Around the second week, something began to change. He noticed that his mind felt quieter throughout the day, not just during his 10 minutes of stillness. The constant replaying of arguments started to soften. He found himself less gripped by the decision, less consumed by the fear of choosing wrong, even though he had not yet made up his mind. He said it felt strange to be less anxious about something so important, and yet the anxiety had genuinely started to lift, replaced by a quiet trust he could not fully explain. Then one morning, sitting in his usual stillness, not thinking about the decision at all, a clarity arrived that felt entirely different from anything his reasoning had produced. It was not a voice, not a dramatic sign, simply a settled knowing that surfaced from underneath the noise, as though it had been there all along waiting for enough quiet to be noticed. He knew, without needing another pro and con list, which direction was right for his family. He told Joel that what struck him most was how undramatic the moment felt. There was no lightning bolt, no overwhelming emotion, just a quiet certainty that felt more solid than anything his months of frantic thinking had produced. Joel explained that this was exactly how guidance tends to arrive once a person stops demanding it on their own timeline. The answer had likely been available all along, but the noise of his anxious striving had been too loud for him to recognize it. Stillness had not manufactured the answer out of nothing. It had simply cleared enough space for what was already true to become visible. The man later reflected that the entire experience had taught him something far more valuable than the decision itself. He had spent years assuming that important choices required intense mental effort, that the harder he thought, the better his conclusions would be. What he discovered instead was that his best thinking often came after he stopped thinking so hard, after he allowed himself to rest in a stillness that had nothing to prove and nowhere urgent to be. He began applying this same practice to smaller decisions as well, pausing before reacting, resting before responding, trusting that clarity would come more easily once he stopped forcing it. Joel often used this story to illustrate a principle he taught throughout his work, that the human mind, however capable, was never designed to carry the full weight of every decision alone. It was designed to work in partnership with a deeper presence, one that could not be accessed through frantic effort, but only through willingness to be still. The father did not abandon his responsibility to think carefully about his family's future. He simply stopped trying to do it entirely on his own, and in that surrender, he found the clarity that his relentless effort had never been able to produce. If this reminder to be still is speaking to you right now, like this video, so it reaches someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe for more teachings on the presence of God. Comment "Be still" if you're choosing stillness over worry this week. There is a story in the Book of Kings that Joel Goldsmith returned to often, because it captures something most people never expect about how God actually reveals himself. The prophet Elijah was standing on a mountain, exhausted, afraid, convinced that his work had failed and that he was utterly alone. He had just fled for his life, and he was waiting, desperate for some sign that God had not abandoned him. And then a great wind came, tearing into the mountain with enough force to break rocks apart. Scripture is careful to note that the Lord was not in the wind. Then an earthquake shook the ground beneath him, and again, the Lord was not in the earthquake. Then a fire swept through, dramatic and consuming, and once more the Lord was not in the fire. After all of that noise, all of that power, all of that spectacle, there came a still small voice, and it was there, in that quiet, that God actually spoke. Joel taught that this story reveals something essential about how most people search for God's presence. They expect him to arrive the way the wind arrived, the way the earthquake arrived, the way the fire arrived, loud, dramatic, undeniable. They want a sign so large it cannot be missed, an answer so forceful it silences every doubt at once. And so they wait for God in the noise of their circumstances, in the crisis, in the emotional intensity. in the moment when everything feels urgent and overwhelming. But Scripture tells us plainly that God was not found there. He was found only after the wind died down, after the earthquake stopped, after the fire burned itself out, in the quiet that remained when all the noise had finally passed. This is why so many people feel like God is silent during their most difficult seasons. They are listening for Him inside the storm itself, inside the panic, inside the frantic search for a solution, and they miss Him entirely, because He was never planning to shout over all of that noise to get their attention. He was waiting, patiently, in the stillness underneath it. Joel explained that the human mind, when it is afraid or overwhelmed, naturally gravitates toward more noise, not less. It wants to talk the problem through again, replay every possibility, search for reassurance from anyone willing to listen. This feels productive, even necessary, but it often becomes another version of the wind and the earthquake and the fire, a storm of mental activity that drowns out the very voice a person is desperately hoping to hear. The still small voice does not compete with that noise. It simply waits until the noise has run its course, because it was never trying to be the loudest thing in the room. There is something worth noticing in the order of events on that mountain. The wind came first, then the earthquake, then the fire, each one dramatic, each one demanding attention, and each one, in turn, revealed to be empty of what Elijah was actually searching for. Only after all three had passed did the quiet arrive. Joel taught that this progression mirrors the spiritual journey many people go through. They chase after dramatic breakthroughs, powerful emotional experiences, sudden fixes to their problems, believing that this is where they will finally encounter God in a way that satisfies their searching. And often each of these experiences comes and goes, leaving them exactly where they started, still waiting, still searching, still unsatisfied. It is only when a person grows tired of chasing the wind and the fire that they finally become willing to sit in the quiet long enough to notice what was there all along. This does not mean dramatic experiences never matter, or that emotion has no place in a life of faith. It means the presence of God Himself does not depend on drama in order to be real. He does not need a hurricane to announce Himself. He does not need an earthquake to prove His power. He was never absent during the storm, but He also was not found inside it, because the storm was never the point. The point was always the quiet that remained once the storm had passed, the space where a person finally stops performing, stops searching frantically, and simply listens. Joel often said that most people are far too busy to hear the still small voice, not because their schedules are full, but because their minds are full, crowded with worry, with plans, with the residue of every anxious thought they have carried through the day. The voice is not hiding. It is simply quiet, and it requires a quiet mind to be recognized. This is why stillness is not simply a nice spiritual idea for Joel, but the actual condition necessary for encountering God's presence at all. You cannot hear a whisper while you are shouting, and you cannot recognize a still small voice while your mind is running through its own version of wind, earthquake, and fire. The invitation, then, is not to search harder or wait for something more dramatic to happen. It is to let the noise pass, to stop feeding the storm with more attention, and to trust that on the other side of all that commotion, there is a voice waiting, one that was never far away, one that has been speaking quietly the entire time, patient enough to wait until you were finally still enough to hear it. Understanding the story of Elijah is one thing, but living from it requires a practice, something you can actually return to in the middle of an ordinary day. Joel taught that the still small voice does not only speak on mountaintops during dramatic crises. It speaks in traffic, in difficult conversations, in the small irritations that build up over hours, in every moment where your mind wants to react before it has had a chance to listen. The first step is learning to recognize your own internal wind, earthquake, and fire, the specific ways your mind creates noise when it feels threatened or overwhelmed. For some people, this looks like racing thoughts, jumping from one worry to the next without pause. For others, it looks like rehearsing arguments, replaying what someone said, building a case for why they are right and someone else is wrong. For others, still, it looks like restless movement, checking a phone repeatedly, filling every quiet moment with some form of distraction because silence itself feels uncomfortable. Joel taught that you cannot skip past this noise to reach the quiet. You have to notice it honestly, without judgment, the way you might notice weather passing outside a window. Once you can recognize the noise for what it is, the next practice is learning to pause before reacting. This sounds simple, but it goes against nearly every instinct the mind has been trained to follow. When something upsetting happens, the mind wants to respond immediately, to fix, defend, explain, or escape. Joel suggested building in a deliberate gap between the moment something happens and the moment you respond to it, even if that gap is only a few seconds. In that gap, you are not trying to solve anything. You are simply choosing not to feed the storm any further, allowing it a chance to pass rather than intensifying it with your own reaction. This pause is where stillness actually gets practiced, not in some separate meditative hour set apart from real life, but right in the middle of the moment that would normally trigger an immediate, anxious response. The third practice involves learning to sit in silence long enough for it to stop feeling uncomfortable. Most people give up on quiet far too quickly, mistaking the initial restlessness for proof that nothing is happening. Joel taught that the first few minutes of stillness often feel like standing inside the wind and the earthquake, because the noise you have been carrying all day does not vanish the instant you decide to be quiet. It takes time to settle. The way sediment in a glass of water takes time to sink before the water above it turns clear. If you stop after only a minute, you will only ever experience the murky water, never the clarity beneath it. Joel encouraged setting aside real time, even just 10 or 15 minutes specifically for this kind of listening. Not to ask God for anything, not to present a list of requests, but simply to remain present and available. The way Elijah remained on that mountain, even after the wind and the fire had already passed. There is also a practice of returning throughout the day, not waiting for a single set time, but bringing brief moments of stillness into ordinary tasks. Before opening an email that might contain bad news, before walking into a difficult conversation, before responding to a text message that stirred up frustration, there is an opportunity to pause, breathe, and quietly remember that a deeper presence is available beneath whatever reaction wants to take over. These moments do not need to be long. Sometimes they last only a few seconds, a brief return to stillness in the middle of an otherwise busy day. But practiced consistently, they begin to change the texture of an entire life, creating small clearings of quiet inside what used to be constant noise. Joel taught that this still small voice rarely announces itself loudly, even after all the noise has passed. It tends to arrive as a quiet knowing, a sense of clarity that feels different from anxious thinking, a peace that settles rather than a solution that shouts. Learning to trust this voice takes practice, because it will never compete with your fear for your attention. It simply waits patiently for you to stop listening to the storm long enough to notice it. The invitation in daily life is not to eliminate every difficulty or to somehow avoid moments of wind, earthquake, and fire altogether. Those will keep coming, because that is simply what life includes. The invitation is to stop searching for God exclusively inside that chaos, and instead learn to recognize the quiet that remains once it passes, trusting that His voice was there the entire time, waiting for a stillness you are now finally willing to practice. A young man came to Joel during what he described as the darkest season of his faith, a time when he felt like his prayers were bouncing off the ceiling and going nowhere. He had grown up in church, had always believed, but a series of disappointments had left him desperate for some kind of confirmation that God was still listening. So he prayed harder, he prayed louder. He filled every quiet moment with pleading, with repeated requests, with long, urgent monologues asking for a sign, any sign, that would prove he had not been abandoned. Night after night he would kneel beside his bed and pour out every fear, every doubt, every desperate question, convinced that if he just said enough, prayed hard enough, pushed hard enough, something would eventually break through. Nothing did. If anything, the silence seemed to grow heavier the more he pleaded into it, until he began to wonder whether God had simply stopped listening altogether, or worse, had never really been there in the first place. He told Joel that he felt like he was shouting into an empty room, and the emptiness was starting to feel like proof rather than simply an absence of feeling. Joel listened to him for a long time before responding, and then he asked a question that caught the young man off guard. He asked him what it might be like to stop praying that way entirely, not because his faith was wrong, but because his approach to prayer had become another form of noise, another version of the wind and the earthquake and the fire, all of it drowning out the very voice he was so desperate to hear. The young man admitted he had never once tried simply being quiet in God's presence. Every moment of prayer had been filled with words, requests, and pleading. He had never allowed for silence because silence felt like giving up, like admitting that he had run out of things to say. Joel gently explained that sometimes the most faithful thing a person can do is stop talking long enough to listen. He suggested a different kind of practice, one that felt almost frightening in its simplicity. Instead of filling his prayer time with words, the young man was to sit quietly for a set period each day, saying nothing, asking nothing, simply remaining present and open. If his mind wandered into old patterns of pleading, he was to gently release those thoughts and return to stillness, not fighting them, not scolding himself, just letting them pass the way clouds pass across a sky. The first several days were uncomfortable in a way he hadn't expected. The silence felt unbearable at first, almost like static, filled with every anxious thought he'd been avoiding by staying busy with words. He wanted to fill it immediately, to go back to what felt familiar and safe, the frantic pleading that at least gave him something to do with his fear. But he kept returning to the stillness, day after day, even when it felt like nothing was happening, even when doubt whispered that this quiet approach was simply another form of giving up on his faith altogether. About 2 weeks into this practice, something shifted, subtly at first, in a way he could barely put into words, when he described it to Joel later. He said the silence stopped feeling empty and started feeling like a kind of company, as though something had been quietly present the entire time, waiting patiently for him to stop drowning it out with his own noise. There was no dramatic voice, no sudden revelation, nothing he could point to and call proof in the way he had originally wanted. But there was an unmistakable shift in the atmosphere of his inner life, a settling, a sense that he was no longer alone in an empty room, but resting in a quiet presence that had apparently been there the whole time. He told Joel that what struck him most was realizing how much of his previous praying had actually been an attempt to convince himself, more than an attempt to actually connect with God. All that pleading, all that urgency, had been less about listening and more about trying to drown out his own fear with enough words to feel like he was doing something. Once he stopped, once he finally let the noise settle, he discovered that the peace he had been begging God to send him had been available all along, just beneath the surface of his own frantic effort. Joel often used this young man's story to illustrate a principle that applied far beyond prayer itself. Many people spend their lives shouting into silence, convinced that volume and urgency are what finally get God's attention. What they eventually discover, if they are willing to stop long enough to find out, is that God was never hard of hearing in the first place. He does not need convincing, does not need to be persuaded through relentless pleading. He simply waits, quietly, patiently, for a stillness that allows his presence to finally be recognized, not created, not summoned, but recognized as something that had never actually been absent at all. If you needed this reminder that God's presence doesn't shout, it waits like this to support this message. Subscribe for more teachings on stillness and faith. Comment still to mark the moment you decided to stop striving and start listening. There is a temptation, after hearing stories like these, to treat stillness as a technique you master once, and then carry with you forever. A lesson learned and filed away, never needing to be revisited again. Joel Goldsmith was careful to warn against this kind of thinking. Being still and knowing the presence of God is not a single achievement you unlock and then move past. It is not a certificate you earn after enough practice. after which your mind simply stops reaching for control and your life becomes permanently peaceful without further effort. It is instead a continual returning, a practice you come back to again and again, sometimes many times within a single day, because the noise of the human mind does not disappear permanently just because you have tasted quiet once before. Every person who has genuinely practiced this stillness will tell you the same thing. There are mornings when the presence feels close, when quiet comes easily, when the still small voice seems almost audible beneath the surface of ordinary life. And there are other days when the mind is loud again, when old fears resurface, when the wind and the earthquake and the fire return uninvited, as though none of the previous stillness had ever happened at all. This is not failure. This is simply what it means to be human, living inside a mind that was trained for years, sometimes decades, to solve problems through effort, control, and worry. Joel taught that the goal was never to eliminate this pattern entirely through willpower, but to build a habit of returning to stillness every time you notice the noise creeping back in. Each return matters, even the 100th return, even the return that happens after you have already forgotten and been swept up in anxious striving for an entire week. There is a particular kind of freedom in understanding this. If stillness were something you had to achieve once and maintain perfectly forever, most people would eventually give up entirely, discouraged by how often their minds wander back into fear and control. But because stillness is a practice of continual returning, every failure becomes simply another invitation to come back, rather than proof that you have somehow lost what you once had. The presence of God was never dependent on your consistency in noticing it. It remains exactly where it has always been, patient and unchanging, waiting for you to quiet down enough to recognize it again, regardless of how long you have been away. This changes what it means to live a life shaped by fear versus a life resting in stillness. A life shaped by fear is constantly reactive, always scanning for the next problem, always bracing for what might go wrong, always trying to control outcomes through worry and relentless mental effort. It treats every silence as dangerous, something to be filled quickly with plans or distractions, because silence itself feels unsafe when your only tool for managing life has been anxious striving. A life resting in stillness looks different, not because problems disappear, but because the relationship to those problems fundamentally changes. Difficulties still arise, disappointments still happen, but underneath all of it there is a quiet confidence that does not depend on having every answer figured out in advance, a trust that the presence which spoke to Elijah in that still small voice has not gone anywhere and remains available in this moment exactly as it always has been. This is what Joel meant when he taught that true faith is not primarily about making things happen. Most people, when they think about faith, imagine it as a kind of spiritual effort, applied toward achieving a desired outcome, praying hard enough to get the job, believing strongly enough to receive healing, having enough faith to force a breakthrough into existence. But the stillness Joel taught points toward something quieter, and, in many ways, more demanding than any of that. It asks you to stop trying to make something happen and instead become quiet enough to recognize what has already been true the entire time. God's presence was not manufactured through effort in any of the stories shared here. It was recognized, uncovered, noticed beneath the noise that had been obscuring it all along. This distinction matters more than it might first appear. Trying to make something happen keeps you in a posture of striving, forever measuring whether you have done enough, prayed enough, believed enough. Becoming still enough to recognize what already is releases you from that exhausting measurement altogether. You are no longer responsible for creating peace out of nothing. You are simply responsible for quieting down enough to notice the peace that was there before you ever started struggling. This is not passivity, and it is not indifference to the real difficulties of life. It is instead a fundamentally different orientation, one where action flows from rest rather than from fear, where decisions come from clarity rather than panic, where love is expressed from abundance rather than desperate need. The woman who finally slept again did not do so because she solved every problem keeping her awake. The father who found clarity about his family's future did not do so because he outthought every possible outcome. The young man who stopped shouting into silence did not do so because his circumstances suddenly improved. In each case, what changed was their willingness to become still long enough to notice a presence that had never actually left, only been buried beneath noise they had mistaken for necessary effort. What does this look like when you carry it beyond a quiet room and into the actual shape of your days, into work, into relationships, into the moments that test whether any of this was real or simply a nice idea reserved for prayer time? Consider how stillness might change the way you move through a demanding job. Most people carry their work with a kind of low-grade anxiety running underneath everything, checking messages compulsively, replaying conversations with a difficult coworker, bracing for whatever crisis the next email might bring. Joel taught that this constant bracing is exhausting precisely because it assumes you alone are responsible for controlling every outcome. A person practicing stillness does not stop working hard or caring about results. Instead, they learn to pause before responding to pressure, to take a breath before answering a tense message, to trust that clarity will come more easily from a settled mind than from a frantic one. The quality of the work does not suffer. If anything, it improves, because decisions made from a place of quiet confidence tend to be wiser than decisions made from panic. Consider what this might mean for relationships, the place where most people's inner noise becomes hardest to hide. Arguments tend to escalate because both people are reacting from their own version of wind and earthquake and fire, each trying to be heard over the other, neither one actually listening. Stillness offers something different here, not passivity, not simply staying silent to avoid conflict, but a willingness to pause before reacting, to let the initial surge of defensiveness pass before speaking. This single practice, pausing long enough to let the first wave of reaction settle, has the power to change entire relationships over time. It creates space for the other person to be heard, and it creates space for you to respond from something deeper than your immediate hurt or frustration. Joel taught that love itself becomes more possible once stillness has quieted the noise that usually gets in its way. Consider what this looks like during genuine crisis, the moments when stillness feels almost impossible to access, when fear is loud and circumstances are frightening, and every instinct screams that this is exactly the wrong time to be quiet. It is precisely in these moments that the practice matters most. A diagnosis, a sudden loss, a financial collapse, a relationship ending. These are the true tests of whether stillness has become something real or remained simply a pleasant idea for calmer days. Joel did not teach that stillness removes you from the pain of these experiences or pretends they are not serious. He taught that even in the middle of genuine crisis, there remains a quiet place beneath the fear, a presence that does not panic, even when everything around you seems to be falling apart. Returning to that quiet place does not fix the crisis immediately. It simply means you are not facing it entirely alone, swallowed whole by your own fear, but instead resting on something steadier than your circumstances, something that was never shaken to begin with. This is perhaps the deepest promise contained in the words, "Be still and know that I am God." It is not a promise that circumstances will always turn out the way you hope. It is not a guarantee that every diagnosis will reverse itself, or every relationship will heal, or every financial fear will resolve exactly as you wish. It is instead a promise about presence, about the fact that underneath every storm you will ever face, there remains a quiet, unshaken reality that has never once been disturbed by what is happening on the surface. Elijah's storm did not stop the moment he found stillness. His circumstances were still difficult after that whisper on the mountain. What changed was that he was no longer facing those circumstances from a place of total isolation and despair. He had heard the voice. He knew, in a way that could not be taken from him again, that he had not been abandoned. This is available to you in exactly the same way, not as a reward for perfect practice, not as something you have to earn through enough discipline, but as a presence that has been waiting patiently this entire time, in every ordinary moment of your life, for you to become quiet enough to notice it. You do not need a mountain. You do not need a dramatic crisis to finally force you into stillness. You can begin exactly where you are, in this very moment, simply by letting your shoulders drop, releasing whatever you have been gripping so tightly, and allowing your attention to settle into the quiet that has been here the entire time you were searching so desperately for something louder. The wind will still come sometimes. The earthquake will still shake things you thought were solid. The fire will still burn through certain seasons of your life. But you now know where to listen once the noise finally passes. And more than that, you know that the noise was never actually where the answer was hiding in the first place. It was always underneath, always waiting, always quiet, always present, exactly as it has been from the very beginning, exactly as it remains right now, in this moment, if you are willing to finally be still. If this teaching on stillness and God's presence spoke to your heart, like this video, subscribe for more teachings like this. Comment "I am still" to confirm you're carrying this peace with you today, and let it remind you, wherever you go next, that the quiet you've been searching for was never far away, only waiting for you to finally notice it.